Hi, my name is Paula Storm, and today I wanted to show you my needle turn without the needle turn technique. So what we need to start with is the applique brush. Now my applique brush comes in a little tin like this, and inside we have the actual brush, and we also have an eyedropper. So the eyedropper is used to fill up your brush. So the brush has a reservoir here. And what I use is actually not a glue, it's a starch. So we fill up the brush here with the starch, and the recipe for the starch comes on the back of the tin. So you mix up your own batch of starch, and the beauty of doing it this way is that once you've bought your little tin, you don't need to buy any refills, and so once you've got it for life. As long as you take care of your brush, it'll last forever. So as I said, we use our eyedropper to fill up the brush with starch and then pop the lid back on. When you take your lid off, you'll see that the brush is about 1/4 of an inch width, which is perfect for what we're going to use it for, which is painting our seam allowances. So that's what we're going to use the brush for. We're going to need a few other little tools. You'll need an iron, and you can just use your normal iron. I prefer to use a little mini iron just because I find it more convenient. I like this brand, the Clover mini iron, but if you have a little travel iron, you can definitely use that. As I said, you can use your normal iron, but I just find once you start doing smaller and smaller pieces, you'll find that it's just a bit awkward and a bit heavy, to be honest. So the other tools that you'll need will be a hera marker, or as a few of my students called it, a hero marker, because you can do so many things with this tool. At one end you can see it's got that rounded edge, the other end is the pointy end, and that's what we're going to be using today, the pointy end. You'll also need some freezer paper. Now I prefer this brand, the Reynolds brand. There is a few other brands that you can get, and they're fine too. As you can see with freezer paper, you've got a paper side which is quite dull, and then you've also got a shiny side on the back. And that shiny side is sticky when you heat it up. So when you iron it, it will actually stick to your fabric. For this technique, we actually need 2 layers of freezer paper ironed together to make a template that's thick enough to use for this technique. So you can see this is one of my offcuts here. So this is 2 layers of freezer paper that have been ironed together. Now you want to put the shiny side down and then another shiny side down on top of that and iron those 2 pieces together, and that's what will give you this nice stiff template that you'll need. 1 layer of freezer paper is just not enough, but as you can see, when you iron this to the ironing board, it will actually just stick temporarily to the ironing surface. It will also pick up a little bit of dust now, or a bit of lint. I'm not sure if you can see it there, but that lint is what we need on the freezer paper, because that will help to make the freezer paper not too sticky, so it won't fray your edges when you peel it off. So that's the tool we'll need. The tools we'll need: our applique brush, our hera marker, our little mini iron, and of course our batch of starch. As I said, the recipe for the starch comes on the back of your tin, so once you've made up your batch, you are set. You don't need to buy any refills or anything. So I'll fill up my brush, I'll cut out a template, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've filled up my brush, so my applique brush is now full of the liquid starch, and I've cut out my little templates here. So I've got 2 layers, as I said before, 2 layers of freezer paper ironed together, so I've still got a shiny side on the back there, and I've got the paper side. What I'm going to do then is iron my freezer paper template onto my piece of fabric. Now with this piece, I know that this edge here is going to be tucked under something else, so I'm not going to worry about adding a seam allowance there. I'm going to cut out this piece with a generous seam allowance. So the beauty of this technique is you can be quite generous with your seam allowance. Traditionally with needle turn applique, you would want to be quite scant with your seam allowance, but this technique you can see that I'm being quite generous with that seam allowance, and it's actually easier if you leave a bigger seam allowance. So I'm going to cut that out there, and leaving, as I said, that generous seam allowance there will make your life a lot easier. What I'm going to do then is paint my seam allowance with the starch. So as I said, it's not a glue, it's a starch. And so it's just going to slightly stiffen the fabric. and hold it in place. Now I'm wanting to make sure that that seam is really wet, soaking wet, so I'm making sure it changes colour. I don't want it to be dripping wet, but I do want it to be soaked right through the fibres, and that will actually really help to turn the edges a lot easier. So I'm not sure how well you can see there, but that seam allowance is really quite wet. And then I'm going to take my little hero marker and my mini iron, and I'm going to use those two tools to turn that seam allowance over the freezer paper template. Now when I first start, to get a nice smooth edge, I'm actually running my finger along the edge of the template there and folding that fabric over. And then I'll use my little hero marker to hold it in place. And what I'm doing is using the iron to dry the fabric. Now how I'm doing this is I'm pulling the fabric over the template and then kind of tucking it underneath the iron and creating little pleats. And you might be able to hear that starch sizzling dry. So as you can see, I'm creating little pleats by pushing the fabric underneath the iron and taking up all that excess fabric. You want to go a little bit at a time, and that'll give you a really nice smooth edge every time. So pull and tuck, pull and tuck. And then just finish it off there by ironing it dry. And you can see I've got a really nice smooth edge to my applique shape there. If you do end up with any little lumps or bumps or anything like that, to get rid of those, what you can do is just rub the iron up against the fabric like that, and those lumps will just disappear. Now to take your freezer paper out, you can be as rough as you like. You just peel your fabric back, peel your template out, and it will just automatically pop back into position with that beautiful smooth edge that you've just made. To do some other shapes, so for example if we want to do a heart shape, I'll take my fabric back out. With heart shapes or anything that's got an inner curve, you're actually better off to put that inner curve on the bias, and that will help protect the fabric and help stop it from fraying. But the starch will actually help protect the fabric from fraying as well. So that's why we want to be quite generous with the starch and make sure it's really soaked through. So I'm just ironing my freezer paper template onto my fabric on the bias so that that edge there is on the bias. And I'll cut it out. Again, we want a generous seam allowance all the way around. And the more generous you are with your seam allowance, the easier you'll find this technique. Now with a heart shape, we have that inner curve at the top there, which is the only tricky bit about doing this shape. And really, once you see how it's done, it's not that tricky at all. So I've cut out my heart shape. Just get rid of my fabric there and get rid of those frayed edges, frayed threads. Okay, so the only thing that you need to do with a heart shape is you need to snip into that inner curve just once. So with traditional needle turn, you would be snipping around all of those curves. With this technique, you don't actually need to. And as you can see, I've taken that snip right into that inner point there. And that's what's going to help us to really get in there and get a nice smooth edge. Okay, so now again, I'm going to paint my seam allowance until it's really soaking wet. And while I'm doing that, I'll just tell you, you can use these templates over and over and over again. That's the beauty of this technique. You can use those templates. My record was, I think, 11 leaf shapes from one template. Eventually, the templates will start to curl up just from being wet and dry and wet and dry. So you will need to replace them eventually, but you will get quite a few uses out of these templates. So I've finished painting my seam allowance. I've paid extra attention to that inner curve there. I've added a bit of extra starch there to make sure that those threads are going to be protected. And then what I do with this inner curve, I'll do the inner curve first, and what I'm going to do is just run that iron straight over the fabric and up and over the template, and then I'm going to iron that dry. I'm going to leave my iron there until I'm sure that that fabric is ironed completely dry. And then I'll start again with my hero marker, working around, pulling over, tucking under, pulling over, tucking under. Now you don't want to be too harsh with this, or you'll end up rolling your freezer paper. But you do want to be quite firm so you get that nice smooth edge. So pull over, tuck under. Now you might notice here I'm using my little finger to actually hold the piece steady so it doesn't slide around on me. So pull and tuck and iron dry. With the second side, once again I've got a straight edge at the bottom there, so I'm going to use my finger to find that edge and make sure the fabric's pulled snugly against the template, and then I'll use my hero marker to hold it and iron it dry. Again, pull and tuck all the way around. With that little bit there, I'm just going to sort of pull it until it's flat and then iron it dry again. And there we have our little heart shape. Again, if you do have any little points, which is quite common when you're first doing curves, just run that. I don't know if you can see, but there's a little tiny point just there. I'm just going to rub that iron on the side, and that's pushing the fabric up against the template and creating a nice smooth edge, so that when you actually stitch this onto your background, you'll end up with that nice smooth curve. And then once again, I can just peel the freezer paper out. With this shape, because I've got the raw edges just here, I will be a little bit more gentle when I'm pulling my freezer paper out, just around that point, so I don't fray the edges. But the rest of it, as I said, it will just pop straight back into position where it was when you ironed it. And there we have our nice, beautiful smooth edge shapes. You can also use this technique for doing hexagons. So I like to use the Busy Fingers papers. And you can use this for any pre-cut shape at all, any shape at all. You can use this technique. I just really like these ones because they're nice and quick. Now the only difference with using the pre-cut papers is that you don't have the sticky side of the freezer paper. So what I do in this case is I just use my little Soline glue stick, and you only need a tiny amount, so this makes your glue stick go a lot further. And then I'll just stick it right in the middle of my hexagon shape. Now if you need help cutting your hexagons using a straight ruler, I've done a video on that, how I cut my hexagons to a perfect shape. So have a look or subscribe to my channel for that information. Okay, so once that's stuck in the middle, that's not going to go anywhere. So once again, I'll just run around the outside with my applique brush until that seam is quite wet. And you can see some fabrics actually have quite a lot of sizing in them, so they do take a bit longer to soak up the starch. But you want to make sure it's soaked right through. And once your fabric changes colour, we're ready to iron again. Now in this case, I actually prefer to use my fingers on straight edge shapes, but I still use my mini iron. I just find I get a much smoother edge. So you can see I'm just pulling the fabric over and ironing it dry. And the beauty of doing it this way, I say that a lot, don't I? But the beauty of doing it this way is that you can take your papers out. So, and your edges, your seam allowances will stay exactly where you put them. So if you like to stitch like I do, your hexagons without papers in or with only one paper in, it makes life a lot easier. You can also use this for apple cores, any paper piecing shapes. You can use this technique. So I'm just folding my edge over, ironing it dry. And that way you don't have to cut the back of your piece open. If you need to take papers out, you can actually take them out before you stitch them down. So you don't need to cut open the back of your piece, which is really good for making cushions and things like that. So you can take your papers out before you hand stitch them down and still end up with really nice smooth edges. So there you go, that's my, my hexagon all ironed and ready to hand stitch. So I hope you enjoy this video. If you'd like more information, please just leave me a message down the bottom of the video. Or if you found this helpful, please give me a thumbs up down the bottom of your screen. Thank you.